We have started discussing theories of development, and we have examined already the liberal conservative school. We are moving now to two other schools, and these two other schools are called radical perspectives on development. Why they are called radical perspectives on development? Because they reject completely the liberal conservative school and offer a new way of looking at the process of social change in the former colonies after they got their independence. Why do we put these two schools together? Because they have much in common. First of all, they attach great importance to the economy. They consider economic factors in general to be the independent variable that leads to changes in the class structure, in the distribution of political power, in the culture, in the legal system, etc. However, it is very important to define what is meant by the economy in these two schools. Definitely in Marxism, the economy in this context refers to the mode of production, the type of economic organization in society. This mode of production is made up of three elements: the techniques of production, the technology, the tools that people use in production. It includes also forces of production, the human actors in this process, and it includes also relations of production, the kind of legal relations linking the forces of production. So under the feudal mode of production, we have the techniques, the tools used in agriculture, but we have also the peasants who toil the land, and we have the landowners. And there is a certain legal relationship linking the two. The landlord, the landowner, owns the land and also has control over those who toil the land. So they cannot leave the land without his permission. Under the capitalist mode of production, we have the machine, and then we have the workers and the employers. We have the working class and the capitalists. We have the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and they are linked together. The proletariat sells its capacity to work to the bourgeoisie. The working class sells its capacity to work to the capitalists. So these are the three elements of a mode of production. Why the mode of production is important? The economic organization in society is important because according to Marxism, the other dimensions of social existence correspond to the mode of production. So the mode of production determines the class structure of society, determines also the distribution of political power, determines culture and the legal system. We can call the class structure in society to be the base, and the legal system, the political distribution of power, culture, all ideas, forms of art, the laws, all these spring from the base. So they are closely related to the base. Of course, they might have some sort of autonomy of their own, but in the final analysis, they are conditioned by the base, by the mode of production. In dependency theory, it accepts this notion of mode of production, but also it assumes that economic conditions determine also political, social, cultural dimensions of society. So according to this theory, countries of the South, the former colonies, are economically dependent, and also they are politically dependent, culturally dependent, media dependent, etc. So that's why these two theories have this in common, the primary importance of the economy in determining the other dimensions of social existence. The second element they share in common is the assumption that class conflict is the mechanism for change. That first of all, class conflict is a fact in all societies, and the class conflict leads to change. Class conflict under the feudal mode of production led to the transition to capitalism. Class conflict under the slavery mode of production led to the change to a feudal mode of production. So class differences of interest are expressed in the presence of different classes, and these classes, because they have opposed interests, they fight each other. This is class conflict, and class conflict could lead to change. The class who triumphs in this class conflict opens the way for a change of the mode of production to another mode in which this class becomes the triumphant class. The conflict takes place between the oppressed class and the oppressor class, between the dominated class and the dominant class. And if the dominated class wins, then this would lead to a change of the mode of production, leading to another mode in which the former dominated class becomes the dominant class. So the bourgeoisie was dominated class under the feudal mode of production. It triumphs in the conflict with the feudal nobility, and therefore this would lead to the demise of the feudal mode of production and the coming of the capitalist mode of production, in which the bourgeoisie becomes the dominant class. The dependency theory, would consider that there are a radical opposition of interests among nations, and therefore this opposition of interests leads to tension, and the tension could lead also to sort of conflict. This conflict, we call it national liberation, and it should, hopefully it should end up in a situation in which not the oppressed nations become the oppressor or become the dominant, but hopefully this would lead to a situation in which there is some sort of equality between the former oppressed nation and the former oppressor nations. So national conflict, international conflict could lead to, should lead to change according to dependency theory. The third element they share in common is that their definition of progress. Progress means the transition from one mode of production to the other. In dependency theory would argue also that the progress means that change of status of countries of the South to become more independent. So also the economic dimension is important here, but progress is comprehensive. Progress is not limited to the economic dimension of social existence, but it affects also the other dimensions. So progress is total, is comprehensive. In fact, we could say that to a certain extent, this is like the modernization school. Modernization is comprehensive. It affects all dimensions of society. So also progress in this school, in these two schools would lead to change, economic, political, social, and cultural. So these are the three features which these two schools share together. Where do they differ? They differ in the consideration of what is important, what is more important. Is it internal relations within a country, or the link between this country and the international market? So for Marxism, the most important thing is internal class relations, internal class conflict, the composition of classes, relations among these classes, tensions amongst them, class conflict, etc. So this is what is important. If we are going to analyze, any situation, we have to look at the class structure of the countries we are interested in analyzing. But dependency, of course, attaches great importance to the internal conditions, but it attaches more importance to external conditions, to the link, the type of relations that the country has with the international market, with the international economic system. So this is in general what these schools share in common and where they differ. Let us focus on the first of these schools, Marxism. This is not an easy task because Marxism, covers a huge amount of writings by Karl Marx, by Friedrich Engels, and writings by the leading Marxist political leaders like Lenin, like Trotsky, like Mao Zedong. Also, there are scholars who wrote on Marxism. So, where do we find a Marxist conception of historical change? We can find this in the writings of Karl Marx. We can find it in the writings of communist leaders. We can find it also in Soviet writings, and we can find it in writings of Marxist scholars. So this is where we can find the Marxist writings. And now we are going to emphasize on one concept which is more relevant to the study of countries of the South, the concept of neo-imperialism. And we find that the core of analysis in Marxist writings in discussing class relations, and also this concept was borrowed by dependency writers. This is the concept of surplus. Producers, those who are engaged in the process of production, once humanity has past the primitive communist stage, they produce more than is required for them to survive. And the difference between what they produce and what they should get in order to reproduce themselves, in order to continue alive, and in order to continue to produce, this difference is called surplus. And the surplus is taken by the dominant class, is taken by the feudal lords, is taken by the capitalists. And for Marxism, this is exploitation. What is taken of the people who are engaged in the production process is their right. This is what they produce, but it is taken, it is appropriated by another class, and this is exploitation, and this is the cause of tension between the two, and this is the cause of class conflict. This notion was taken also by the dependency school, and instead of considering that the surplus is taken by the dominant class, the surplus is taken by the colonial country, by the countries who dominate the international market. And so this is a sort of exploitation, but it is national exploitation. It is exploitation of countries, not exploitation of classes. Of course, the two are related together because inside the country there are those also who exploit the working people. These could be transnational enterprises, these could be foreign enterprises, these could be also local classes who are in alliance with foreign powers. So the notion of surplus is very important in analyzing the situation of the former colonies, and we are going also to see what sort of suggestion that Marxism and dependency school suggest to overcome underdevelopment. Let us try to find out what Marx said about the situation in the former colonies, at least the former colonies he studied at his time. You know that he was born in 1818 and died in 1883. So during this period, colonialism was going ahead and was, about to dominate all parts of the non-European world. Marx was interested in particular in India, to a certain extent also China. He knew something about Persia, so he did not really offer a complete study of colonialism. He was mainly concerned about the evolution of societies in Europe or the process of historical change in Europe. But from his writings, we can get a general understanding of what he means by progress. So progress for him is a change in class relations, and there is a certain logic in this change. He, at least in the case of Europe, he found the logic in the gradual move from situations where people are economically exploited and politically oppressed to a situation where economic exploitation and political oppression would end. So therefore, he envisaged, five dominant modes of production. Each of them follows the other. The primitive communist mode, where everything was owned by the community. In fact, there was no property per se, because things were owned by things were accessible, not owned, accessible to everybody. So there was no need for anyone to own anything. And this led, as a result of technological change, which enabled people in these primitive societies, for the first time, to produce more than what is needed for their own consumption. And this led to the transition to a slavery mode of production. With the invention of some primitive tools, it became useful to put some people to work and to live off their work. And this was the beginning of the slavery mode of production. Again, conflict within the slavery mode of production led to the destruction of this mode and its replacement, its success by the its succession by the feudal mode of production. And also, the invention of machines led to the change of this mode of production, the feudal mode of production, to capitalism. The invention of machine as a form of capital, led those who own this capital to, engage in conflict with the feudal nobility and therefore move to the capitalist mode of production. So, and within the capitalist mode, tension engendered by the exploration of surplus by the capitalists, which causes the discontent of the workers. This conflict would lead to the transition to socialism. So under socialism, at least, most of the economic exploitation would end, but not completely. And there will be some sort of political oppression because the state remains. Only when socialism gives way to communism, economic exploitation and political oppression would end. And you know this from your studies of history of political thought. So progress is the move from one dominant mode of production to another. Why? Because this move implies more liberty, more emancipation for mankind. But the total emancipation would happen when people move to communism, where there is no state, there is no private property. So the move from slavery to feudalism meant some emancipation, some liberation, because under the slavery mode of production, people were owned by other people. But under the feudal mode of production, people are not owned by other people, but they are attached to the land. And then under capitalism, no one owns another person, but the workers sell only their work power to the capitalists. But in theory, they are free to enter into a contract with the capitalists. So this is, and they are free also to change from one contract to another, from one employer to another. This is highly different from the situation under feudalism or under slavery. So the move from one mode of production to another would mean more emancipation. So if we apply this to developing countries, if these countries move from feudalism to capitalism, this is more emancipation. And there will be more emancipation if they move from capitalism to socialism. We did explain the concept of mode of production. We explained also the 5 dominant modes, the primitive communism, the slavery mode of production, the feudal mode of production, the capitalist mode of production, and the socialist mode of production, which should lead to communism. Now, what about the colonies? What about non-European countries? Karl Marx did not offer a general theory of historical change in non-European countries. This is a very important point. So this talk about the 5 dominant modes, this trajectory of the move from primitive communism, ending in communism, passing through slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. This applies for Karl Marx. This applies to Europe. This is not the case in non-European countries. What is the situation in the non-European countries? He did not talk about all of them, but he suggested that in countries which rely on irrigated water, countries which are located in river valleys, and depending on the level of development in these countries, what they could be characterized by the presence of what Marx called the Asiatic mode of production. Under the Asiatic mode of production, there is no private property, and the need of the society to cultivate the land would require cooperation in order to provide this land, provide the water of the river to distant areas. Living around river valleys requires also cooperation in order to strengthen the banks of the river, in order to guard against the floods, in order to guard also against the time when the level of water in the river goes down. And Marx would say that, depending on the level of culture in society, some cultures are capable of, cooperating together without the need for an external authority to oblige people to work together. So he said that this is the situation in northern Italy, in the lowlands, meaning, the Benelux countries, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. In these countries, society is so developed that people cooperate voluntarily with each other in order to carry out these irrigation works. But in China, India, and Mesopotamia, Marx, of course, was European, and he had this, European, bias that, people who are outside Europe are less developed. Therefore, European people can cooperate voluntarily with each other, but, in non-European countries, people have to be forced to cooperate together. So a kind of power is present which obliges those people to cooperate together. This becomes sort of central power. Who will have the control over the river water? And since water is important for cultivation, so with this control over water, it controls also the land. So there is absence. He said that there is absence of private property in these non-European countries. And as a result of this, the central authority, combines both political power and economic wealth. It is politically powerful and is needed by society in order to supervise the carrying out of irrigation works. And in this way, it can deprive people from water if it wants, or it can also it deprives people of water if it wants, so it controls water. But anyway, he suggested that there is absence of private property in these countries. The land, cultivated land, is the ownership of the government, ownership of the king, but it is not private ownership. And he said that what is particular about these countries is that there is no internal dynamism for change. If this central authority who is supposed to supervise irrigation works, if it is enlightened and if it takes interest in maintaining irrigation works, keeping the protection of the dams and guarding against the floods, this would lead to increase in agricultural production, increase in the production of food. There will be a surplus of food which can enable this authority to build the temples, to build the palaces, etc. But when this authority, for one reason or another, its members fight among each other, or it does not devote much time to taking care of irrigation works, this would lead to deterioration of agricultural conditions. The production of food would decrease, there will be famines, and there would be no surplus in order to spend on palaces and temples, etc. And the civilization of these countries would go through a period of stagnation until new people come to authority and start to take care of irrigation works. So, civilization in these countries, which called, Asian countries, or he calls this kind of economic organization Asiatic mode of production. So under the Asiatic mode of production, there is no internal mechanism for, change, for the transition to another mode. In fact, it would be only European powers who would come and, destroy the Asiatic mode of production and move these countries along the path of capitalism. So this is his view of non-European countries. And in this view, in fact, since the Asiatic mode of production, would lead to stagnation, it is civilization would be cyclical, but there would be no way out of, this type of economic organization, except when European countries come and without knowing it, they, neglect also irrigation works because they are more interested in getting people of these countries to import their goods, and they might be interested in other crops. They would introduce private ownership. So in this way, the Asiatic mode of production would disappear and would be succeeded by, nascent capitalism. So in this way, colonialism unconsciously becomes the agent of history that would move these countries along the path of progress, meaning move from the Asiatic mode of production to some sort of capitalism, maybe later on to socialism. So these are the ideas of Karl Marx which are relevant to our understanding of countries of the South. Other communist leaders have added to the work of Karl Marx. Karl Marx envisaged socialism to come after capitalism. So socialism for him, the socialist revolution would happen in highly developed capitalist countries. Lenin studied the situation in Russia, and he found out that in Russia there were several modes of production. Russia was not a highly developed capitalist country. There was, beginning of capitalism in Russia, next to remains of a feudal mode of production, remains even of primitive communist mode of production, also presence of small producers mode of production. All these existed in Russia together. So Russia was not a highly developed capitalist country. So why Lenin started a socialist revolution in a country which was not fulfilling the image of Karl Marx of a revolution starting in a developed capitalist country. Lenin thought that in order to attack capitalism, capitalism should not be attacked where it is strongest. Capitalism should not be attacked where it is highly developed. In Great Britain, at his time, France or Germany, it could be easily defeated where it is weakest. And Russia, with a very low level of development of capitalism, was a weak link in the global capitalist structure, and therefore it would be wise to attack capitalism in Russia where it is weakest. Mao Zedong went even a bit further. He led a socialist revolution in China, which was, mostly an agrarian society where, capitalism was much less developed than in Russia. So these two communist leaders, very important ones, Lenin led the Bolshevik revolution and, paved the way for the establishment of the first socialist country. And Mao Zedong led the socialist revolution and took socialism to Asia, to China, which was the largest country in terms of population. So from the work of these two, we can understand that, for, followers of Marx, the socialist revolution could take place in countries where pre-capitalist modes of production are dominating, and there is a small capitalist sector. So socialist revolution can take place in these social formations which are still dominated by capitalism, but they are characterized by the presence of other pre-capitalist modes of production, next to capitalism. As Russia became the first socialist country in the modern world, and in fact there was no socialist country before that, Soviet writers used Marxist writings in order to explain the situation in the former colonies, and they were influenced very much by the work of Lenin, by the Lenin's analysis. So the situation in Russia ended with Russia, building socialism without the support of the advanced working class in the more advanced capitalist countries. So did they suggest the same thing to former colonies? No, in fact, they were quite reluctant to call for a socialist revolution in the former colonies. They would say that the conditions were not ripe for a socialist revolution in these other countries. What they suggested is that maybe not the working class, but the intellectuals, civil and military, intellectuals could lead a process of radical social change in these countries, but they would not take these countries immediately to socialism. They would take these countries to, introduce reforms like agrarian reform. They would try to strengthen the economic independence of these countries, and they would put the base for a public sector, state-owned sector of the economy. This they would call a non-capitalist path to development. So, the best prospect for the former colonies is not to move to capitalism, nor to socialism, but, to try to pursue a non-capitalist path of development, trying to put an end to the pre-capitalist modes of production, put an end to forms of slavery, of feudalism, of primitive communism in these countries. They should try to strengthen their economic independence by, promoting national control over economic resources, and they would try also to push for industrialization in these countries with the help, with the support of the Soviet Union, and they would pursue independent foreign policy. They would adopt a policy of neutrality between the two major powers or non-alignment. This they would call national democracy or revolutionary democracy. So the best prospect for former colonies, according to Soviet writers, was not to move to socialism or to capitalism, but to try to pursue a non-capitalist path of development. What is the end of this non-capitalist path to development? The end is uncertain. This could take these countries to socialism, or these countries could go back to capitalism. The destiny of non-capitalist path to development was not agreed upon among Soviet writers, and they did not suggest that this would lead necessarily to socialism. And the best examples of a non-capitalist path to development of a country dominated by revolutionary democracy was Egypt and Cuba. Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser from 1952 to 1970, and Cuba under Fidel Castro after 1959. In Cuba, the move from non-capitalist path to development to socialism took only 2 years, from 1959 to 1961. 1961, Fidel Castro finally said that he was communist. He did not say that when his guerrilla forces entered Havana in 1959. It took him 2 years, and in fact, the Cuban Revolution was not led by the Cuban Communist Party. So, Fidel Castro started as a revolutionary Democrat, but, ended becoming a communist. Gamal Abdel Nasser did not end up becoming communist. He continued to be a revolutionary Democrat, but, Sadat came later and started the open door policy, which took Egypt along the path of capitalist development. As I said, the sources of studying the Marxist perspective on development, the sources include writings of Karl Marx, writings of communist leaders, writings of Soviet scholars, and writings also of scholars who are Marxists, but they are not living in the Soviet Union. They are the Marxist scholars, particularly in Western countries and in countries of the South. So they picked two concepts which came out of the analysis of Lenin in particular, and also of the writings of Karl Marx. Lenin talked about imperialism, and he suggested that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. Marx also wrote about imperialism in the case of India, and some sort of imperialism also in the case of China. But Lenin, had this theory that imperialism, in fact, is a way of resolving the crisis of capitalist countries. And he has his famous book titled "Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism." Of course, capitalism has gone through other stages after that. And in fact, scholars of the South and also some scholars in the Western countries added, to the work of Lenin, the concept of neo-imperialism. So Lenin talked about imperialism because at his time, imperialism was manifested in the military occupation of countries in Africa and Asia. Although he offered an economic analysis of imperialism, but imperialism at his time, was associated with the military presence, was political domination of countries of the South. So after the death of Lenin, in fact, after the Second World War, many of these former colonies got independence and got rid of the presence of military bases or foreign military troops in their territories. So this was, they wondered what is the situation in these countries, and they came up with the concept of neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism. Also, those Marxist scholars outside of communist countries took the notion of economic surplus as a way of understanding underdevelopment in countries of the former colonies. Economic surplus I did explain before, but economic surplus is expropriated by the landowners, by the capitalists, or also by the state or foreign enterprises. So in any way, this economic surplus is not used for expanding the productive base in the former colonies. The feudal lords take the surplus and use it in order to, have luxurious houses in cities, in leading luxurious way of life, or in transferring their wealth, part of their wealth from ownership of land to ownership of buildings in urban areas. And the capitalists might use part of the surplus in order to expand their production, but the capitalist sector is very limited in the former colonies. Foreign enterprises would take the surplus and send it to their own countries. So it would help in the development of capitalist countries, not in the development of the former colonies. And governments would take the surplus and would spend it on, the army, on the media, on buildings that satisfy the needs of the government. This is they would be more interested in show projects, projects that that can show off their power, but they would not use it in order to strengthen or expand the productive capacity of their country. So the notion of surplus was taken by some Marxist writers, particularly Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy. In fact, these are two Marxist writers who used to publish something, a publication known as Monthly Review, which was published in the United States of America. So they used this notion of economic surplus in order to understand why underdevelopment continues in the former colonies. And they wrote a famous book, I think, The Political Economy of Growth. And other Marxists, developed the notion, the analysis of Lenin, and instead of talking about, imperialism as the high stage of capitalism, they talked about neo-colonialism. What is this neo-colonialism? Those scholars would say that, political independence does not mean really national liberation. Political independence is sham, it's just a facade. But, the former colonies continue to be dominated by the economies of the former colonial powers. How is this economic domination perpetuated? It's perpetuated through foreign investments. Foreign investments would enable the former colonial powers to reap benefits, high rates of interest and profit on their investments in countries of the former colonies, or they will continue to offer foreign aid, also, which enable former colonial powers to maintain and strengthen and enhance their control over the destinies of the newly independent countries, because this foreign aid is conditional aid. It's not given entirely free, and rarely it serves in promoting genuine economic development in these countries. Also, economic domination is perpetuated through control over international financial institutions, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, who try to push these countries along the capitalist path of development. Also, another way through which economic domination of by the former colonial powers of their former colonies is maintained through the presence of so-called comprador elites, whose interests coincide more with those of foreign powers. They are engaged in either, import trade, importing goods from the former colonial countries and exporting raw materials to them. They have financial arrangements with them, or they are engaged in certain activities which are related, which promote the interests of the former colonial powers in banking, insurance companies, etc. So through this comprador elite, economic domination by the former colonial powers continues. So this is new imperialism. What is the way out of neo-colonialism? It is through national liberation. National liberation, which would take these countries along the path of enhancing their control over their national resources, of establishing, a state-owned sector which limits foreign domination of these countries, promoting industries, putting an end to the presence of these comprador elites by introducing agrarian reform and by limiting excessive wealth, etc. So national liberation is the way out of this state of neo-colonial control over the newly independent countries. All right, so this is one view, this one Marxist view of the situation in developing countries. Now, a Marxist scholar, Bill Warren, had a completely different view. He did not have a negative view of political independence. For him, political independence means something significant. It gives leaders of the former colonies the capacity to, adopt policies independently, policies that would promote, development in these countries, and they would be interested in industrialization, and the transnational companies would help them. And in fact, they might even promote capitalism in these countries. And for Bill Warren, this is not a bad thing. So what does Bill Warren say about the situation in the former colonies? The first argument, he said that it is not true that political independence is meaningless, that the political independence is sham. No, political independence is very important, is quite significant. Why? Because with political independence, the leaders of the former colonies can decide what they would like to do in order to push the process of development in these countries. And some of them might opt for capitalist path to development, and he is not pessimistic about the capitalist path to development. He would say that under capitalism, these countries can get rid of the pre-capitalist modes of production, can get rid of feudalism, can get rid of slavery, can get rid of even remnants of the primitive organization of production, and they can also promote industrialization, and industrialization can improve the situation in these countries, and capitalist development in these countries is good because capitalism is better advanced, is a higher stage of development compared to feudalism or slavery. So Bill Warren was not dismissive of the value of political independence, and was not dismissive of the policies promoting capitalism in former colonies. But he was a Marxist. Why was he in favor of capitalism in these countries? Because on the one hand, capitalism is more advanced than feudalism, and also capitalism promotes, expands the size of the working class in these countries, and with a large working class, with a large industrial working class, there is good prospect for socialism. So, instead of jumping from, pre-capitalist modes of production to socialism, Bill Warren would say, no, it is better to have a capitalist phase of development in these countries, and this would lay the foundations for socialism later on. Is this argument valid? Does it make sense? Well, of course, there are different views on this, but people who are critical of Bill Warren would say that, in fact, capitalist development did not work well in countries of the South. Still remains of feudalism, existed in these countries, and there was no prospect of a successful capitalist development in these countries. The levels of unemployment, poverty were quite high in most of these countries. If there is successful capitalist development, it would be limited to a small number of former colonies. So we know now that the concept of neo-colonialism was taken up by Marxist scholars outside of the Soviet Union, and it was used also by Soviet writers, but anyway, it became a major concept in analyzing the situation of the former colonies. The other concept is that of the surplus value. I did talk about it, and I did give example of two authors who promoted this concept, who used it in order to analyze the situation in the former colonies. These are Paul Sweezy and Paul Baran. And I refer to their book, The Political Economy of Growth, which inspired, in fact, the other school, the Dependency school. They use the concept of economic surplus, which is important for development, because the presence of an economic surplus is important for development, because development requires investments. And where do these investments come from? They come from this surplus, which exceeds what is needed from the country's production to satisfy the basic needs of the people. The investment comes from the savings. So the savings constitute the surplus. People do not save under normal circumstances. People do not starve to death and save. After people satisfy their basic needs of food, drink, shelter, housing, etc. If there is something that is left, this is what they would save. So we can talk at the level of society in general, what exceeds that part of production which is required in order to satisfy the needs of the people, the current needs of the people, is a surplus. And this is the surplus which would be used for development, for investment. And I did suggest that the way the surplus is used explains why some countries would go along the path of development or would suffer, sluggish development or no development at all. And Paul Warren and Paul Sweezy, identified those who control the surplus, the economic surplus in former colonies. They are the big landowners, foreign companies, the government, and I did give examples, how they would use the economic surplus. Their use of the economic surplus either would lead to, waste of this economic surplus on, prestigious projects established by the government, which add nothing to the productive capacity of the country, or, real estate, urban real estate by landowners, which would increase their income but would not also add to the productive capacity of the country, or would be repatriated to the colonial powers by foreign companies, and in this way this would be lost for developing countries. How to get out of this? By getting national control of the economic surplus and using it for national development. but this is not happening. At least this is what Paul Sweezy and Paul Baran said when they published their book in the 1950s. But this book had major influence in the analysis of on the development in developing countries and also in the writings of the dependency school. Very good. So what are the concepts which we should retain from this analysis of Marxist writings on countries of the South? Well, of course, Marxism, modes of production. I would add social formation, imperialism, neo-colonialism, the surplus value, which gives rise to exploitation, non-capitalist path to development or non-capitalist mode of production. We could add also national democracy, revolutionary democracy, and national liberation, which is also could be led by national democracy, revolutionary democracy, or national bourgeoisie. All right, okay. Now we are in a position to move to another school. What are the propositions of the dependency school? There are two major propositions. One is that when countries of the periphery are integrated in the international market, they would fall victims of exploitation by countries of the center. Why? Because this integration in the international market would lead to external appropriation of the economic surplus. The economic surplus takes different forms, different values of the products of developing countries, lower wages for their workers, but anyway, it is exploitation of labor, and I explain this later. Workers and peasants of the countries of the South would put longer hours in order to get the same products, which workers and peasants in countries of the North get, but by working less. So, even when they use the same technology, still they would get less for the same amount of work. So this is, exploitation. So this is translated into, part of the surplus produced in countries of the periphery is appropriated, is owned, is repatriated to countries of the North, and in this way they would lose the resources they could have employed in order to increase their investments and to push for their development. A second proposition is that dependency relations are not the same. Dependency relations evolve over time. So in the beginning, dependency relations were, took the form of primitive dependency, theft, or, forceful exchange. The gold, which decorates the crown of British monarchs, was forcefully stolen from India. Khedive Ismail in Egypt and the Sultan of Morocco were tempted to conclude loans with European bankers, which brought high interest rates, and this led the two countries to be indebted, and this led to the bankruptcy of Egypt, and this paved the way for imposing joint foreign control over the budget of the country. So this is, primitive dependency. But colonial dependency is not theft, is not use of force, but under colonial dependency, the economies of countries of the periphery are shaped in such a way as to produce raw materials, minerals for export to countries of the center. So they become specialized in the production of raw materials to be exported to countries of the north, of the center, and this is a kind of unequal exchange, because under these conditions they cannot industrialize. They are condemned to be raw material producers and exporters, and in many cases they rely on just one crop: cotton in Egypt, oil in Saudi Arabia, bauxite in Zambia and Chile, etc. And to other sectors of their economy are not developed. The third type of dependency is financial and technological dependency. When these countries try to embark on the path of industrialization, they get either loans or foreign investments. They get loans from foreign banks, and these loans carry high interest rate. They get foreign investments, and they have to pay profits, interests, fees, etc. When they buy foreign technology, they have to pay a lot to get foreign technology. Therefore, even when these countries embark on the path of industrialization, they continue to be dependent because the sources of finance and the source of technology are within countries of the center. And, as we are going to explain later, this is a cause of the indebtedness problem in countries of the South. We move now to the second school as part of this radical perspective on development. The dependency school argues that the world is divided between two groups of countries, the center and the periphery, or the metropoles and the satellites. These terms correspond to developed countries and developing countries, countries which are specializing in the production of manufactured goods, and countries which are specializing in the production and export of raw materials, the colonial powers and the former colonies. So what kind of relations exist between these two groups of countries? These are dependency relations, and these dependency relations reflect different positions in the international division of labor based on unequal exchange between countries of the periphery and countries of the center. So dependency means unequal exchange. Countries, put to the international market goods designed for developed countries, but this kind of exchange implies loss of value by the developing countries in favor of developed countries. This kind of exchange implies some sort of exploitation. So these are dependency relations, and we'll explain. Dependency relations are based on exploitation of labor in developing countries through various means. Either lower wages given to workers in these countries by the foreign enterprises which employ them, or by the monopolies of developed countries which control international trade, and therefore get the basic raw materials, energy from developing countries at much less than its real cost, at much less than its real value, or by getting high returns on investments in these countries. So dependency relations in this sense are related to different positions in the international division of labor, causing unequal exchange between countries of the periphery and countries of the center. As a result of this, the structures of the economy and society in some countries in the periphery are conditioned by what is happening in other countries, in countries of the center. So dependency comes from the fact that what changes the state of the economy and society and politics in the dependent countries is the outcome of what is happening in countries of the center. So an economic crisis in countries of the center leads to an economic crisis in countries of the periphery. Also, the type of political organization in countries of the center becomes also, the type of political organization in countries of the periphery. So what happens in the periphery is conditioned by the center. So therefore, these are dependency relations. What are the major concepts used in the school? The concept of center periphery. We have explained that the center refers to the former colonial powers, highly industrialized countries. The periphery refers to developing countries, countries of the south, countries which are specializing in the cultivation and the production of raw materials and energy for export to countries of the north. So periphery refers to the south, former colonies, developing countries. Now the surplus value, well, this is the amount of production which far exceeds what is required to satisfy the basic needs of people in developing countries. And in the dependency school, the surplus value is appropriated by the countries of the center. Hierarchy, the international system is seen as a sort of hierarchy. On top, countries of the center, and then in the middle there is one category which could be called, the semi-periphery, and then we have the periphery at the base. It is important also to note that within the center there is a certain hierarchy. So there are dominant center powers like the United States, Germany, France, etc. But then there are lower centers. You could say that Spain is a lower center, compared to the United States or to Germany. Portugal also is a lower center, but Portugal could be a center for former Portuguese colonies in Africa, like Mozambique, like Angola, like Guinea-Bissau, and also there is a certain hierarchy within countries of the south. Of course, there are the semi-peripheral countries, which are regional powers, like Brazil, like India in the past, like Iran, like South Korea. So these are semi-peripheral countries. Semi-peripheral in the sense that they are periphery of the center, periphery of the United States, of Germany, France, Great Britain, but they are centers for developing countries within their own region. So countries like Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia are periphery for Brazil, and countries of Central America are a periphery for Mexico. Maybe Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are periphery for India. The same thing also for Burma, etc. So this is the notion of hierarchy, depending, of course, on the structure of production in these countries. Then the concept of this articulation is very important. Countries of the center have integrated sectors of the economy. So the production of petroleum in the United States serves primarily interests of American industry. U.S. agriculture serves primarily American agro industries. Transport in the U.S. serves primarily the need of agriculture to provide raw materials for industry, the need of people to move within the United States. Service sectors like scientific research, like medicine, like the movies, also they are addressed to the local market primarily, and then they go abroad. This is not the case in developing countries. For a long time, the petroleum sector in Saudi Arabia was not serving other sectors in Saudi Arabia. So for a long time, Saudi Arabia had electricity shortage, despite the fact that it was a major energy producer for the world. Why? Because the production of oil in Saudi Arabia was serving not the Saudi economy, but was serving economies of Europe and the United States. The same thing also for, I don't know, the production of bauxite in Chile or copper in Zambia. Was not feeding local industries, but was feeding industries in other countries. So it is, sort of externally oriented kind of relations. And the banking sector, in fact, the national bank in Egypt was serving mainly, the needs of foreign importers of Egyptian cotton. And therefore, for a long time, the National Bank of Egypt, Al-Bank Al-Ahli, was not serving, other agricultural crops. So we needed to increase our production of rice, our production of wheat, but the National Bank, Al-Bank Al-Ahli, would not finance these crops. Was only financing the cultivation, production, and export of cotton. So therefore, the cotton sector in Egypt was not articulated, was not linked to other sectors of the Egyptian economy until Talat Harb came and established, textile industry in Egypt. So therefore, part of Egyptian cotton was serving Egyptian industries, but for a long time that was not the case. So I give examples of banks, I give examples of local production of raw materials, and I will give also examples of the transportation network. Transportation network of Egypt headed towards Alexandria. Why? Because Alexandria is the main port that would link Egypt to European markets, but links to Upper Egypt were quite primitive compared to this. So our transport headed to the north, not to the south. Why? Because the markets are in the north. So even the transportation network was directed more to the needs of the center. So this is this articulation. So economic sectors in countries of the south are not closely integrated, are not closely connected to each other. This is not the case of economic sectors in developed countries. So this is what is meant by the notion of this articulation. As a way out of this situation, I would suggest 4 elements of strategy. One, historically, was inward-oriented development. This is what Talat Harb was trying to do in Egypt, and this was one of the slogans of the 1919 revolution, that we should buy Egyptian goods. Talat Harb tried to substitute locally produced goods for foreign imports. So instead of importing textiles from Great Britain, we produce our own textiles. Instead of importing shoes, later on radios and TV sets, we produce them at home. So this is inward-oriented development. This is called also import substitution industrialization. So import substitution industrialization is quite equivalent to inward-oriented development. We try to become more dependent on what we produce and less dependent on what we import. This policy was adopted by Latin American countries, by India and by Egypt, particularly during the war years, the First World War, and in the interwar period, and also after in the 1950s and early 60s in countries of Latin America, particularly Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, and that was relatively successful in using locally produced raw materials, establishing industries, giving rise to the birth or to the expansion of a national bourgeoisie, expanding the size of the working class, resolving part of the problem of unemployment, but it was not entirely successful in lessening dependence on foreign powers, on foreign economies, on the international market. Why? Because in order to establish industries, we need machines. How do we get the machines? We get the machines from the former colonial powers, from the countries of the center. So, therefore, this became a constraint on development, because inward-oriented development meant less exports, meant less foreign currencies. And therefore, in order to continue, we needed to import capital equipment. We needed to import countries of the South needed to import machines. But in order to import machines, they must have foreign earnings. But their exports, shrank. And therefore, they were faced by a shortage of foreign currency. So, the idea came that, in fact, instead of focusing on substituting imports, these countries should focus on promoting exports. And this is called externally oriented development. And this is the strategy which succeeded in countries like South Korea, like Taiwan, like Singapore, later on also Brazil. So this is externally oriented development, export promotion. But this is also within the context of dependency. Now, dependency writers suggest, breaking links with the international market. This they would call delinking, breaking the links with the international market. But delinking is not limited only to the economic sphere. Delinking could be also political. Let us, be the masters of our own destiny. Let us take, our own decisions. Our policies should not be dictated by foreign powers. Let us also have our own concept of development. Our concept of development should not be the one which is advised by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. We should try to find out our own concept, our own idea of development. Also, in our culture, we should not try to emulate modes of consumption, modes or ways of life of countries of the center. We should try to promote a mode of consumption, a way of life that corresponds better to the positive values of our culture. So does delinking mean, no relations whatsoever with the international market? Of course, opinions differ, but anyway, delinking is an orientation. Does not mean breaking links completely with the international market, because this is, of course, impossible. But delinking means, first of all, imposing national control over economic resources. Reflecting on the ideas of development and developing our own concept of development, our own doctrine of development. And it means also having pride in our own capacities and our capacity to shape our own future. But if delinking means less cooperation with developed countries, it means also increased cooperation with other developing countries. So maybe we can get some of the financing for our development from other developing countries. We can get it maybe from Gulf countries, or we can get, some advanced technologies from other developed countries. We can get, in fact, we do get, scientific support from Argentina. Argentina does help Egypt in building, did help Egypt in building nuclear reactors. Nuclear reactor. The second nuclear reactor in Egypt was built thanks to support from Argentina. Perhaps we can get also, technology from India, from Brazil, from Mexico. So if countries of the South cooperate together, then they would be able to promote their own development according to their own wishes, their own values, and also they would gain a bargaining power with countries of the North. So promoting, South-South cooperation, this would be called, this should aim at achieving collective self-reliance. So countries of the South can rely on their own resources. Of course, not completely, not entirely, but at least to a large extent. If they rely on their own resources, they would be less dependent on what they could get from countries of the north, countries of the center. All right, so these are the major concepts used in dependency analysis. All right, these are the concepts, but what does this dependency school say about development under conditions of dependency? There are two views. One quite radical view: there cannot be any development under conditions of dependency. Maybe, Saudi Arabia could increase its production of oil under conditions of dependency with continued relations with foreign American and British companies. Maybe also Zambia could increase its production of copper, maintaining or under relations with British companies. Egypt can cultivate more lands with cotton. Yeah, in this way, the gross national product of these countries would increase, but the structural relations with countries of the center remain, in the sense that there is exploitation, there is extraction of the surplus to the advantage of countries of the north. There is unequal exchange between these countries specializing in the production of raw materials and importing manufactured goods from the north. This is unequal relations. There are unequal terms of exchange here because countries of the south sell more working power in terms of hours of work, to countries of the north. So, how many hours should a peasant in Egypt work in order to be able to get a radio or TV set? And how many hours should an American worker work in order to get a radio or TV set? Okay, you might say that the techniques of production are not the same. All right, let us say, how many hours an oil worker in Saudi Arabia would have to work in order to get a radio or TV set. And how many hours? Using the same technology, an American worker would have to put in order to get a TV or a radio. I think this could illustrate to you that whereas a Saudi worker or someone in the Saudi industry would have to work maybe, I don't know, 2 months in order to get a TV set, and using the same technology, maybe, an American worker maybe would work for 1 week in order to get a TV set. So the difference between 1 week and 2 months, 8 weeks, this is exploitation of the work of the Saudi worker. And you can apply this to textile industry, to car industry, etc. When the same techniques of production are used, but there is a big difference of what a worker can get, using the same number of hours, and what his counterpart in a developed country can work. I think this would give you an idea about the exploitation of labor. There are, other manifestations of this unequal exchange between countries of the north and countries of the south. You could apply this also to investments. The rate of return on capital in developing countries is much higher than that of developed countries. Why? This is also some sort of unequal exchange. So this is, what produces underdevelopment. So for André Gunder-Frank, so long as these, structural relations continue, even an increase of production in countries of the periphery would be not development, would not be leading to development, but would constitute only development of underdevelopment. So long as, the same pattern of structural relations, specialization, division of labor in the international market continues, this would be exploitation, this would be just expansion of underdevelopment. However, another Koller, within the dependency school, argues the opposite. Under certain conditions, this kind of dependency relations could lead to development, but it is dependent capitalist development. It's not ideal kind of development. It is dependent capitalist development characterized by inequality and disintegration of countries of the South. Why did Cardoso come to this conclusion that under conditions of dependency, some kind of development can take place? Let us know who is this Cardoso. Henrique Fernando Cardoso was a professor of sociology at the Federal University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. He became later finance minister and was very successful as a finance minister, became very popular, and he had prestige not only as brilliant university professor, writer on dependency, but also because he was one of the prominent figures of an opposition party under the military regime that ruled Brazil from 1964 until 1985. As I told you, was successful professor, successful minister of finance, became very popular, successful politician. So he ran for the presidency of Brazil and became the president of Brazil for 2 terms. I think 1992 until 2002. What is his argument? He said that the impact of dependency, in fact, is not the same. Impact of dependency on development is not the same in all countries. It does vary from one country to the other. Why? This depends on the structure of classes in the dependent country. If there is, some sort of local bourgeoisie, local capitalist class, who is, clever, who can, control, part of the national market. And there is, sort of, working class, and there is also a large market, maybe also a advantageous geographic position, and, wealth of natural resources in the country. In this case, dependency could have an impact different on this country than on another country where there is no national capitalist class, no working class, no diversity of natural resources, no advantageous geographic position. So the local capitalist class together with a competent government that knows what is good for the country, the two together can get terms of relations with the companies of the center, with countries of the center, which are favorable to development in their own country. So, the impact of dependency would vary then from one country to the other, depending on local conditions. What are these local conditions? First of all, the presence of a local bourgeoisie, local, capitalist class, also the competent government, a government that, knows how to bargain with the countries of the north. So under these conditions, a relatively powerful local bourgeoisie and a competent government, a better bargain could be reached with the capitalist countries, with the capitalism of the center. And according to this bargain, this local bourgeoisie would have a better share in the benefits of associated development, together with foreign companies. So foreign companies are not excluded. They would be invited to come. But, under terms negotiated with them by the government and the local bourgeoisie. So this could lead to some sort of dependent capitalist development. And as I said, this position is not accepted by Andre Gunder Frank, who cannot conceive of development under conditions of dependency. But this kind of associated capitalist development or dependent capitalist development has certain features which are not all good for developing countries. What are the special features of this dependent capitalist development according to Cardoso? Well, economically, it's true that foreign enterprises would engage in manufacturing, and this is the wish of the government and the bourgeoisie of the periphery country. But they are not going to bring, all what is required for this investment from their own country. They would bring, small fraction of what is needed, but they would rely on local financing. They would rely on local banks to finance their investment. They would get loans, credit from the local banks. So they are not going to bring all the capital, financial capital they require from their own country. And in return, they would reap, huge benefits. They would reap large profits from the developing countries in terms of what they export from this country at lower price, also in terms of certain benefits. They can get lower taxes, etc. But anyway, what they give to the developing country is much less than what they would get from this developing country in different forms over a long period of time. And in fact, this is the cause of the foreign debt of the more advanced developing countries. The difference between the more advanced developing countries and the less advanced developing countries is that the more advanced rely mainly on foreign capital. The less advanced rely on foreign aid, and foreign capital would bring repatriation of profits, of interests, of fees for technology, etc. Whereas foreign aid usually is associated with low interest rates. And also this kind of associated dependent development could rely on loans from foreign banks. So on the one hand, you have loans from foreign banks, and on the other hand, you have profits, interests, fees on capital, etc., which are paid to foreign companies. So this would contribute to growing debt on the part of these more advanced developing countries. And therefore, when we talk about the problem of the debt, it is not the debt of a country like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Central African Republic or Somalia. It is the foreign debt of Brazil, Mexico, Thailand, Indonesia, Argentina, South Korea, etc. So the largest part of the foreign debt of developing countries is the debt of the highly advanced or relatively advanced countries in the south. So this is, one feature. So on the one hand, you have foreign investments, but on the other hand, also you have repatriation of interests, profits, fees on capital, fees on advanced technology. So where do you put the balance? Very difficult. So this is, one feature. This kind of development has also its social features. The foreign sector attracts the most ambitious, the most talented, the most skilled of people of the middle class, of the working class in developing countries. You have the best engineers, the most qualified engineers would be attracted by the foreign firms. Foreign firms not go to any graduate of the faculty of engineering, but would go to the top graduates of the faculty of engineering. Those who have many skills, those who have the capacity to communicate, those who can speak the foreign language, those who are willing to work, under a foreign management, those who can deal also with the external affiliates of this transnational enterprise. And workers who would go to these factories also are the most skilled and the most capable of the working class in the developing country. So you have this category of people who are the most skilled, the most ambitious. They would work for the foreign sector, and in return, in many cases, they would get better salaries and better working conditions. Compare these to the majority of workers, the majority of graduates of universities work in the national sector. Of course, I mean nothing wrong with them, but their conditions of work would not be as good. Their salaries would be lower, and also that pattern of culture, attitudes, values, associated with each of these two groups, are not the same. So people who work with the foreign firms look to the foreigners, look to foreign countries as a source of progress, as the model to be emulated in everything, not just in technology, organization of production, etc., but also in terms of songs, movies, mode of dress, mode of consumption. And on the other hand, those who are employed in the national sector would look to foreign companies and foreign countries as exploiting their country, as perpetuating a state of subordination on these countries. And their culture is not a good culture, and they would not like to emulate their mode of dress, their mode of consumption. They might not be able even to emulate this, of course, not all of them. Some of them might like also to emulate the foreign mode of consumption and life, but some of them, not all of them. So, in fact, this would lead to the division of the country into what could be called two nations. You have two groups of people who live in the same country, who are citizens of the same country, but they don't share conditions of work, conditions of life, values, attitudes, modes of dress, modes of consumption, etc. So this, promotes national disunity in countries of the periphery. So for this reason, in fact, this kind of associated capitalist development has also its cost, economic, social, and cultural. But under what political arrangements does this kind of associated capitalist dependent development take place? For Cardoso and for other writers who analyzed particularly the case of Brazil, they would say that there is a sort of tripartite alliance. There are three groups whose interests are not the same, but they have common interests. So they have common interests, but at the same time also they may have specific different interests. But what unites them together is these common interests. What are these three groups? You have local bourgeoisie who is working with foreign enterprises. Not all the sections of the bourgeoisie are working with foreign enterprises, but there is one section of this bourgeoisie, maybe the big bourgeoisie, is working with foreign enterprises, is oriented towards foreign markets, is highly advanced in the kind of technology it uses, and it is capable of working with international companies. And then you have state bureaucrats, senior state bureaucrats. They are also quite capable. They are quite competent. Do not underestimate this. And they have their own interests. They would like to develop their country, and they find that the best way to develop their country is to, engage in relations with the transnational companies. Of course, in Egypt, we are proud to have a visit by the manager of General Motors, of Volkswagen, of Mercedes, and we would like to attract Mercedes, Volkswagen, General Motors, General Electric, to come and invest in Egypt, either working with, public sector companies or working, in some cases with Egyptian companies. So something like this, has been shaped in Brazil and Latin American countries. It's tripartite alliance between foreign capital, representatives of foreign capital, the local bourgeoisie, local capitalist class, the big bourgeoisie, la haute bourgeoisie, and senior state officials who have some sort of advanced training in the art of management, in economics, maybe science, etc. So this is the tripartite alliance. The three groups have common interests with foreign, the two groups have common interests with foreign companies. Of course, we can include the local representatives of foreign companies. So you have here three categories of citizens who find that they have common interests with foreign companies. And the workers who are employed by these, joint venture companies also find an interest in maintaining cooperation with foreign companies. So Samir Amin, called this, the kind of social democratic alliance. These three sections are allied together, in fact, against the interests of the majority of people in their own country and against also the interests of a large section of people in advanced countries. This is the political arrangement under which this dependent capitalist development takes place. Mind you, dependency means integration of countries of the South in the international market. So it is, one dimension of globalization. And therefore, we find that the writers in this school, in fact, also in the Marxist tradition, focused recently on globalization. And they tried to analyze globalization. But for them, globalization is a new phase in the development of capitalism. This is a new phase in the development of capitalism characterized by, intensification of the movement of foreign capital and acceleration of the rate of this movement. Mind you, this is quite similar to the analysis of Lenin. Lenin argued that, capitalism, when it moves from the stage of competitive capitalism to that of monopoly capitalism, finds that it has little prospect of continuing its expansion in its own markets, and therefore it becomes willing to engage in foreign markets, either to look for raw materials or to find places for investment. Lenin considered imperialism to be the highest stage of capitalism, driven by the need of monopoly capitalists to find an outlet for their investments. So something similar to this is the essence of the argument of dependency and Marxist writers when they come to look at globalization at present. They consider it a response by capitalism, by advanced capitalism, to its crisis in its own countries. We did talk about this before, but capitalism, finds that its rate of profit is declining, is decreasing in its own countries. So, if you invest in the US, this would bring maybe a rate of return on capital of 4%, 5%. The rate of interest in the US now is 0. So, if you invest in industry, if you get 5% or 10%, this is very good. But to invest in Brazil or Egypt or Indonesia, this could bring a rate of return of 20%. Why? Because there are taxes in the US, because the cost of labor in the US is quite high. But countries of the South try to attract foreign capital, and therefore they do not require foreign companies to pay, taxes for some time. They offer even incentives, provide even infrastructure for these companies, and the cost of labor in these countries is very low. So therefore, the return on capital in developing countries is higher. So, globalization is the response of this intensification, this increase in the movement of capital across borders, is a response by capitalism to its own crisis in its own countries. So this is the response by capitalism to its crisis. And this could, according to the analysis of Cardoso, this could lead to some sort of development in some countries of the South, where the local class structure and the type of government allow for the bargain constituted by or leading to dependent capitalist development. All right. So this is, how they view. So globalization could bring, some development in some developing countries, as we have seen, and that was the argument of Cardoso. But most countries of the South would not be able to benefit from globalization because there are constraints on this globalization producing this kind of associated capitalist development in all countries of the South, irrespective of their class structure. Maybe even when the class structure is quite favorable to this, but still there are constraints. Why? First of all, if all these countries engage in export promotion, industrialization, export promotion strategies, then who is going to import? This is, a complex argument, and we have to think of it. So if all countries are exporting the same goods, if foreign enterprises go to developing countries in order to get cheap manufactured products from these countries, who is going to import? So, well, in fact, there will not be, the counter argument is that foreign enterprises would not be going to developing countries in order to, get the same products from all these countries. But even if this is the case, but also with higher levels of income, people have the possibility to choose. I have a high income, and I know that there are cars in the market, but I may prefer a German car, not a French car or British car. And in fact, trade among developed countries consists of trade in the same goods. Germans buy French cars, French Renault, and the French buy German cars, BMW or Volkswagen. So anyway, this is one argument. Think of it. If all countries engage in export promotion, this could lead to crisis in international trade. But we have not seen this crisis so far. However, there is, another side of this argument, is that, some countries would face competition from other developing countries who can offer cheaper labor or who can offer better advantages. So I think this is called race to the bottom. So Vietnam is competing with China because wages of Vietnamese workers are much lower than those of Chinese workers. So another country would come up with even lower wages than those of Vietnamese workers. So in this case, this could lead to better conditions, in fact, for foreign companies and bad conditions for developing countries. Think of this argument. The second argument is that this is a serious argument. If all countries embark on industrialization with the help of transnational companies, this could create environmental problems because the amount of raw materials in the world is limited. And therefore, either we are going to deplete, to finish off all the raw materials existing in the world, and that was the warning of Club of Rome in the 1960s, that continued economic growth would lead to the depletion of raw materials and natural resources which are needed for future generations. So this would endanger sustainable development. But also, this could lead to serious environmental problems. Accelerated industrialization would increase pollution, would lead to global warming. And in fact, a large part of pollution in the world now comes from the newly industrialized countries, comes from countries like China and India. So if all countries, adopt the same strategy of industrialization, then this would increase pollution, would promote global warming, which is dangerous for the whole of humanity. Thirdly, this model of dependent capitalist development is not desirable, is not good, is not attractive. Why? Because it takes place under authoritarian governments. It took place under, the success of this kind of development took place either under military regimes or highly authoritarian regimes. The countries who pursued this strategy of development, like Brazil, South Korea, China, etc., violated labor rights, violated civil and political rights, because foreign companies like to go to countries which enjoy political and, more importantly, social stability. They don't like to go to countries where workers, are organized in powerful trade unions and ask for their, fair wages, better working conditions, etc. So, this kind of development took place under conditions of suppression of the right of workers to organize and their right to negotiate their wages and working conditions. And also this was associated with violations of civil and political rights. So in this sense, this kind of development is not desirable. Was this possible in the past? Is it still possible now? This is, of course, a big question now. This type of globalization uh, is associated with violations of different categories of human rights, not only labor rights, but it is also, even when it is successful, it does not always promote employment and good wages for workers and for engineers and middle class people who are working there and directly or benefiting indirectly from globalization, because it is also characterized by volatility, crisis. Um, Globalization could lead to, expansion of the world economy, expansion of world trade, better conditions for developing countries. But it is characterized also by globalization. It's characterized also by recession. The world economy does not remain the same. And since this is capitalist globalization, so capitalism goes through cycles, and the occurrence of crisis in capitalist economies is quite cyclical. So there are, periods of expansion followed by periods of stability and then periods of recession. So, and this was seen recently, 1997. Asian countries suffered the East Asian financial crisis, and levels of income dropped even to half of their level almost overnight. And this led to major changes in countries like Indonesia, in countries like Thailand. Suharto, the long-time military dictator of Indonesia, fell from power as a result of the East Asian financial crisis. Also, the 2008, there was a financial and banking crisis in the US, and this had an impact on not only on other highly advanced developed countries, but also on developing countries. And now we are witnessing, a crisis caused by COVID-19 or coronavirus, which is affecting levels of production, employment, travel, tourism, all over the world. So globalization is characterized by volatility. Not everything remains the same. There would be periods of expansion, maybe prosperity, and there would be also periods of recession and decrease of production and employment. Also, as we have seen, globalization, which means intensification and acceleration of the movement of capital, could lead to a high indebtedness of developing countries who have to pay interests, profits, fees for transnational companies. And there are certain techniques. These are called, I think, bad business practices on the part of transnational companies. Of course, they establish so-called global supply chains in the sense that the production process is divided into different parts which take place in different countries. So they get from developing countries parts of that would go to, to be used in order to complete the product. So they would, on paper, they would pay developing countries much less than even the cost of what was produced in this country. But in return, when they give something to these developing countries, they would charge higher on paper. So this differential pricing would cost developing countries large amount of their resources because they are paying what is produced within their borders at less than its real cost, and they would pay for what they get from transnational companies much higher than the real cost. So this is well known. These are well known techniques by transnational companies. So this could be part of the debt of the developing countries. So globalization is associated with increased indebtedness on the part of developing countries. And, there is, also a sort of political arrangement under which this kind of relations continues. Samir Amin called this a sort of social democratic, bargain, by which certain sections of the dominant class and the working class in developed countries benefit from this kind of globalization, sharing the benefits with certain sections of the bourgeoisie and the working class in developing countries. But the majority of population in developing countries and the majority of population in developed countries also suffer from this. And that's why we see a revolt against globalization, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. In the meeting of the World Trade Organization in Seattle, I think maybe 1996, there were demonstrations by American workers against the World Trade Organization. And recently in France, les Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, demonstrated against also globalization. And President Donald Trump built his political capital out of his critique of globalization. And for this reason, he got votes from the American working class. So those who suffer from globalization include, large sections of the working class who are not involved in this, arrangement with transnational companies, and peasants, marginalized groups, and even large sections of the middle classes in these countries. What do you think of this analysis? Do you think it is interesting, is relevant? Does it improve our knowledge of the working of the international economy and how it affects the process of development in countries of the South? Of course, Marxist writings and the contributions of Dependency School have been the object of examination and critical study by scholars. And several points of critique were addressed to this. Of course, it does explain, part of what is happening and how, international market globalization affect developing countries. But there are, some issues with this analysis. The first issue is that both the Marxists and dependency writers consider politics to be a dependent variable. So long as the country is economically dependent, it is also politically, socially, and culturally dependent. And this is not the case. Look at Algeria and Saudi Arabia. The two, in terms of the dependency school, are dependent. But the type of politics, foreign policy, cultures vary, are not the same in the two countries. Also, a country might be dependent, but politically may act against dependency. Is the argument of Cardoso the explanation here that the difference between Saudi Arabia and Algeria is a different class structure in Algeria compared to Saudi Arabia? This is a big question. But a dependency analysis, some of it is reproached, is blamed, is found to be, underestimating the importance of politics. Maybe Bilwarin here, is having a convincing argument that, politics, means a lot. And he went as far as to say that political independence means a lot also. So the autonomy of politics also means a lot. So this is, one point of critique. Also, but also this, could apply to Marxism. Even when the same class structure exists in two countries, still there could be different political trajectories for the two countries. Did class structure change between the period of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and the period of Anwar Sadat? The two of them, each of them adopted policies completely different from what was adopted by the other leader. So is it because of differences in class structure? Class structure remained almost the same. Of course, Anwar Sadat promoted capitalism, but when he decided to embark upon open door policy, was it because he was facing a different class structure? So therefore, I think politics has to be seen as an autonomous activity, which is not at least in the short term, is not determined entirely by class structure. Maybe in the long term, but in the short term, it's not determined by class structure. So this argument about the autonomy of politics applies to the Marxist and dependency analysis as well. The second point of critique is that some dependency writers do not differentiate among countries of the periphery, irrespective of their differences in terms of their history and social structure. So, should we consider all developing countries to be the same since they are dependent? Isn't there a difference between India and Sri Lanka? Isn't there a difference between Sri Lanka and, let us say, Myanmar, could be due to the history of the country, could be due to, different culture, etc. The analysis of dependency is seen to be too general. Glossing over differences of history, social structure, history of the state in these countries. Another counter argument to the analysis of dependency school and even neo-colonialism is that neo-colonialism has been associated with development. Shouldn't we consider South Korea or Thailand or Malaysia? Malaysia is a case of neo-imperialism, no? But dependency and neo-imperialism in the case of Malaysia was associated with development. Same thing also in Singapore. So it's not true that dependency would be always associated with underdevelopment. It could be associated with development, at least successful cases of development that we know of. A fourth argument is that the proposition that development in the North was fed by exploitation of the South runs counter to the fact that most of the trade of countries of the South is among countries of the South. If it is claimed that exploitation of the South was the source of investment growth in countries of the North, then this would assume that trade with the South accounted for a large part of benefits of trade in countries of the North. But we find that most trade of countries of the North is with other countries of the North. And the share of the South in this global trade for a long time did not exceed 25%. Maybe it is higher now because of growth in China, India, and Brazil. But still, most of the trade of developed countries is with other developed countries. So are developed countries exploiting each other? So this is also another point. A fifth point is that the two schools, in fact, do not offer a way out of underdevelopment. Is socialism the way out of, underdevelopment, according to Marxists? But we have seen fall of socialist regimes in Eastern Europe, and the failure was economic as political and cultural also. So socialism is the way out. There is less credibility for this, although some people still believe that socialism should be the way out, but it should be a different kind of socialism, not Soviet socialism. China succeeded in promoting its economic development by borrowing many capitalist practices. So socialism, old-style socialism, cannot be the way out, or does not seem to be the way out. Is state-led development is the way out? Models of state-led development in countries of the South also failed. So, what is the way out? The two schools do not point to one single success story which did not adopt a capitalist mode of development, or which did not end in promoting a capitalist mode of development. So these are the most important points of critique addressed to these two schools. And it's up to you to decide what we should retain as valid, as convincing, as useful from the analysis of these two schools. I don't know how long this lecture, took, but anyway, it's not enough just to listen to my explanation and to read the PowerPoint presentation. You have to know more about dependency and Marxist school by going through the two chapters I'm suggesting from a book written by B.C. Smith, chapter 2 and chapter 4. Chapter 2 on theories of imperialism and colonialism, and chapter 4 on neo-colonialism and dependency. All right, we are going to move to something else next week. All right, good luck.